You ever lie awake at night, wondering what it was like to deliver babies in a candlelit barn, while a Puritan accused you of witchcraft mid-contraction? Welcome to the cozy, blood-soaked world of colonial midwifery, where women juggled childbirth, spiritual warfare, and community suspicion, often in that order. It was a job with no anesthesia, no salary, and a high chance of being blamed for demonic possession. But hey, at least it wasn't boring. Tonight, we're going to gently drift through history's most horrifying bedtime stories, starting with the ones who literally brought people into it, still here. Then dim the lantern, settle your bonnet, and hit that subscribe button, because this isn't your average sleepy history lesson. It's time for some restorative horror. Close your eyes. You're in a room that smells like tallow, sweat, and someone's very enthusiastic attempt at masking bodily trauma with dried lavender. A fire crackles nearby, which sounds charming until you realize it's also the only light source besides the single beeswax candle melting into a suspiciously chipped pewter dish. In the corner, a woman is screaming. Not just your average movie scream. No. This is the guttural wail of someone experiencing childbirth in the 17th century, with absolutely no painkillers and a prayer circle for an epidural dot. Welcome to Colonial. America here midwives weren't just delivering babies. They were moonlighting as amateur priests, herbalists, community therapists, scapegoats, and occasionally sorceresses. These were the women called upon in the dead of night with nothing but a shawl, a birthing stool, and a deep familiarity with suffering. They weren't paid in money most of the time, but in vegetables, bread, or grudging social credit. You know the medieval version of Yelp stars, but 5 stars didn't mean great service. It meant no one died. Now, if you're imagining a trained professional who studied anatomy and reproductive biology, allow me to disappoint you early. Midwives in colonial America were trained through what was generously called observation, and more accurately described as trauma, repetition. You became a midwife by being around other women giving birth, and not fainting. Congratulations. You're now in charge of helping a person push a human out of themselves. Armed with only linen rags, herbal tinctures, and the haunting realization that any mistake might get you accused of witchcraft. And this wasn't hyperbole. You were always one stillborn baby away from becoming the reason someone's crops failed or a goat started walking funny. You see, in a time when theology explained most of science, birth wasn't just a medical event, it was a spiritual battlefield. Midwives were the frontline troops, armed with scripture and sass, expected to guide both the mother and the baby safely across the metaphysical minefield of original sin, demonic interference, and, heaven forbid, female autonomy, labor. Itself was more than pain, it was a divine test. And every successful delivery wasn't just a survival story. It was a triumph of moral fortitude. Every failure, on the other hand, a convenient excuse to start muttering about curses and hidden sins. If the baby died, maybe the mother had been reading the Bible wrong, or dancing, or wearing red. And if the midwife didn't perform the right psalm, in the right tone, at the right moment, she wasn't just negligent, she was inviting the devil into the birthing room. Let that sink in. You're elbow deep in a medical emergency, with no gloves, no modern sanitation, and someone's aunt in the corner loudly questioning whether you were baptized correctly. Midwives also had to memorize prayers, lots of them, and recite them like verbal antibiotics. Psalm 121 was a fan favorite. You know, the one about lifting your eyes to the hills? Very comforting while simultaneously hoping your uterus doesn't literally fall out. Prayer was medicine, and if that didn't work, you threw in some boiling herbs and hoped God was into rosemary that day. Now imagine the pressure when the baby didn't cry. That moment the silence was a living horror film. In modern times, we wait for the cry as a formality. In 1692, it was everything. A baby that didn't cry was possibly dead, or worse, a changeling. The eerie, folklore-laced idea that fairies, or Satan, depending on the denomination, had swapped the real child for something other. At that point, the midwife had to make a choice: try to resuscitate the baby with whatever method colonial America considered gentle, or immediately begin a whispered baptism with trembling hands before the soul. And any shot at posthumous salvation slipped away. Oh, and do it fast. Because if the baby died unbaptized, the mother might spiral into shame, fear, or worse, be blamed for bearing a cursed child. Sometimes the midwife herself would be blamed. A neighbor would whisper that she'd seen Goody Harper mixing herbs at midnight, or that she once laughed during childbirth, which everyone knew was a sign of spiritual corruption. And just like that, your unpaid gig turned into a one-way ticket to the gallows. Or, if you were lucky, just excommunication and a permanent side eye. From the baker, the spiritual intensity was matched only by the physical bleakness. No anesthesia, no gloves, no fetal monitors, no idea if the baby was coming feet first until it was halfway out and stuck like a demonic cork. In those cases, the midwife had to reach in and turn the baby by hand. Yes, by hand. In a time when washing up meant wiping your palms on your apron and whispering an apology to God. There were no sterile instruments, just knives, hooks, and forceps. If you were very, very unlucky, they had names like blunt hook or craniotomy scissors, which tell you everything about the outcomes they were designed for. Midwives preferred to work without them, because using tools meant things were already going terribly. And yet, here's the astonishing part. These women were respected in their communities, at least for a time. They were the first to hear newborn cries, and the last to comfort a woman whose body gave up before the baby came. They saw families at their most desperate, most ecstatic, and most destroyed. They carried the town's secrets like bloodstains on an apron visible to no one but impossible to wash out. Midwives weren't just healers. They were repositories of generational knowledge. They knew which families had miscarried, who had twins, who had lied about due dates, and who was sleeping with the tailor. They were walking archives of both life and rumor, and that made them powerful, which, in colonial society, was never safe for a woman to be. So what did happen when the baby didn't cry? Let's talk about herbs, shall we? Lavender for calming, sage for cleansing, mugwort for maybe not waking up tomorrow. To the modern eye, that sounds like a Pinterest board. To a 17th century Puritan, that was a dead giveaway you were practicing witchcraft, or worse, trying to control your own reproductive health in colonial America. Midwives had one job: deliver babies and somehow survive the aftermath. But there was an unspoken second job: not getting burned at the metaphorical and sometimes literal stake. Because every cup of brewed tea, every poultice, every whispered blessing was being watched. Not by doctors, of course. They were mostly absent. No, by neighbors, the true authorities. And neighbors had a sharp eye for anything ... suspicious. See, being a midwife was a strange kind of social tightrope. You had to be competent, but not too confident. Nurturing, but not too assertive. You had to know things, but pretend. You didn't know them too well, because knowledge was power, and power in a woman's hands. That was unnatural, unholy, unregulated. Let's imagine you're Goody Clark, a midwife with 11 successful deliveries in a single winter. Impressive, right? Too impressive. Suddenly, someone's cow stops producing milk. Someone else's child gets a fever. And before you can say God's will, someone's whispering that maybe you caused it. After all, what exactly is in that herbal tonic you give the new mothers? It doesn't help that midwives kept strange hours, always slipping out at night with candles and bundles of herbs, coming back with blood on their skirts and that haunted, 1,000-yard stare that only comes from watching another human being scream out a soul. They were respected, yes, but never entirely trusted, because while they helped bring life into the world, they also stood right there when it left. And colonial people didn't have the luxury of separating the physical from the spiritual. Every failed birth was an opportunity to point fingers. Every unnatural death demanded a supernatural explanation. And that brings us to the terrifying overlap between midwife and witch. Same tools, same timing, same gender. The biggest difference: who liked you? Let's take the real-life case of Elizabeth Morse, a midwife in Newbury, Massachusetts, accused of witchcraft because, and this is almost too ironic, she was too good at comforting grieving families. People noticed that after a baby died, she knew exactly what to say, almost as if she'd seen it before. Or worse, caused it, yes. The woman who held crying mothers and buried stillborn infants was now being blamed for their sorrow. Because if you were too calm during a tragedy, you were suspicious. If you were too emotional, you were hysterical. If you smiled too much, you were hiding something. And if you frowned too often, you clearly hated children. It's almost funny. Almost. Let's pause here. Just long enough to breathe in this ridiculous contradiction. A woman with knowledge was feared, but a woman without knowledge was useless. And yet, both were punished. Let that sink in. Colonial America wasn't just hard on women. It built an entire framework of fear around their very existence. And in no space was that fear more concentrated than the birthing room. Now enter the other player in this paranoid dance: the church. Ministers held deep suspicions about midwives, mostly because they operated outside male control. Church leaders couldn't supervise a birthing room the same way they could a pulpit. Women gathered in these private, emotionally raw spaces, without men, without oversight, with blood, pain, prayer, and, worst of all, autonomy. What really happened in those rooms? What were they saying? Were they criticizing husbands, questioning sermons, discussing sin in a tone that wasn't completely miserable? The horror-so ministers began keeping tabs. Some pushed for midwives to be registered with church authorities. Others demanded written statements detailing each delivery: who was there, what was said, whether any strange phenomena occurred. And sometimes they got what they were looking for. There's one chilling report from 1678, where a midwife supposedly delivered a baby with cloven hooves and a hairy brow. Was it a birth defect? Probably. Was it described in the court record as the devil's spawn? You bet it was. The midwife in question was interrogated, humiliated, and only narrowly escaped conviction because, and this is real, her brother was friends with a prominent landowner. Nepotism, saving accused witches. Since the 1600s, still, many weren't so lucky. If a mother died in childbirth, or if the baby didn't survive, and the midwife had any kind of prior incident, a dispute, a strange dream someone gossiped about, a moment of visible frustration, she was at risk, especially if she was old or unmarried or childless. The holy trifecta of suspicious femininity. Take Bridget Bishop. She wasn't technically a midwife, but her trial during the Salem witch hysteria shows us just how icily social standing flipped. Bridget wore bright clothes. She spoke her mind. She ran a tavern. She had opinions. And when 3 infants in her town died in the same month, that was enough. Rope, gallows, done. And yes, midwives were absolutely caught in the crossfire during the witch trials. Some were named in testimonies. Others fled towns. A few just stopped practicing altogether. Can you blame them? Imagine spending your life elbow deep in other people's pain, risking infection, exhaustion, and emotional trauma, only to be labeled a demon because you made a strong cup of tea and muttered a Latin phrase that sounded too confident. There's a bitter irony here. Colonial society wanted babies, lots of them. Women were expected to bear 10, 12, even 15 children, and somehow survive it. But the very people who made that possible, the midwives, were constantly punished for it. So what does it say about a society that fears its healers, that turns helpers into threats the moment something goes wrong, that chooses superstition over gratitude? It says, not much has changed. Let's say you're pregnant in colonial New England. First of all, congratulations, and also, I'm so sorry. Because while a modern pregnancy might involve prenatal vitamins, gender reveal parties, and that awkwardly cheery playlist your OB insists on playing, colonial pregnancy came with none of those. Instead, it came with whispered prayers, handwritten, funeral plans, and the lingering suspicion that your womb might be cursed. Pregnancy wasn't seen as a journey back then. It was a spiritual landmine, a physical ordeal, a potentially fatal condition you were expected to endure repeatedly, while smiling modestly and clutching a Bible. And no, you didn't get a baby shower, you got a shroud, just in case. From the moment a woman was suspected, yes, suspected of being pregnant, she entered a kind of social purgatory. Congratulations, you're now a sacred vessel, a symbol of community, continuity, and a walking death risk. The town prayed for you. The minister mentioned you in sermons. Neighbors offered unsolicited herbal advice, and you quietly drafted your will. Because yes, that was a normal part of pregnancy in the 17th century. Women prepared for childbirth, the same way soldiers prepared for battle by settling debts, confessing sins, and making peace with the fact that this could very well be it. Midwives often encouraged mothers to write final letters to their husbands, not love letters, instructional ones, like, don't remarry that weird neighbor lady, or name the baby after my father, not yours. Warm, romantic stuff. Now, the delivery room, if you could call it that, wasn't a sterile suite with white noise and essential oil diffusion. It was usually a bedroom, or a barn, or whatever space could be temporarily evacuated of men and livestock. The windows were shuttered, not for ambience, but because open light was believed to let in evil spirits. The room was dark, hot, and packed with women, all whispering, praying, and sweating profusely. Sometimes, screams were muffled with cloth or hymns, and the midwife, she orchestrated this ritual of pain and hope, timing the boiling of linens with the recitation of psalms. If she was especially prepared, she might burn rosemary or juniper to purify the space and mask the smell of what was, essentially, medieval surgery without instruments. One strange detail, the birthing stool, it was a hollowed-out wooden chair with no seat, just a rim for the mother to sit on while gravity did its brutal, unrelenting thing. No recline button, no support pillow, just grit, groaning, and the overwhelming pressure of keeping both your soul and your child's intact. To distract the laboring mother, some midwives hung screen cloths, thick, padded tapestries meant to absorb sound. This wasn't about reducing noise pollution. It was so the neighbors wouldn't think something unnatural was going on. Because if your screams were too intense, someone might assume a demon was being born. Not a metaphorical demon, a literal one. The worst part, nobody talked about it. Not really. Pregnancy was considered a woman's domain, which meant men didn't learn much about it unless they were ministers writing terrifying sermons about Eve's punishment. Publicly, childbirth was framed as noble suffering, a moral trial. Pain, after all, was God's way of reminding you that Eve bit the apple and you're still on the hook for it. Privately, women were terrified, but the culture offered no space. To say that out loud, fear was considered a sign of weak faith. So instead, mothers sat in silence, clutching handkerchiefs and reciting scriptures, pretending they weren't already planning how to say goodbye to their older children. And there were so many ways things could go wrong. Breech births, hemorrhaging, infection, retained placenta, undiagnosed twins, stillbirths. There were no ultrasounds, no prenatal screening, no reliable knowledge of fetal position. You didn't know if your baby was okay until it came out and cried, or didn't. And if it didn't, the silence could break more than just a heart. It could break a family. It could start rumors. You know what did make noise though? The gossip. Oh, colonial towns ran on it. If a woman miscarried, some said it was punishment for secret sins. If she labored too long, others wondered aloud what she'd done to deserve it. If she survived too many births to isolate, people whispered that she was using dark powers. And if she died, well, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Neatly packaged grief with a moral bow. There's one especially eerie custom that deserves a spotlight here. Churching after surviving childbirth, a woman was considered spiritually impure and physically tainted, because apparently going through hell and back wasn't enough. So she wasn't allowed to return to church until she was ritually cleansed by a priest. This ceremony was often performed 6 weeks postpartum. That is, if she was alive. It was less about celebration and more about reintegration. A spiritual decontamination, like running holy water through a trauma filter. Of course, while all of this was happening to the pregnant woman, the labor, the prayers, the judgment, the possible exorcisms, where was the father? Downstairs, reading, or praying, or pacing a wooden floor so aggressively it probably left grooves. Men were not present in the birthing room. That was women's work. A private, bloody, sacred horror they were neither prepared to witness nor expected to understand. Ironically, some of them blamed midwives when things went wrong. Not because they knew better, but because they didn't know anything at all. And when people don't understand something, they fear it. And when they fear it, they punish someone for it. So yes, giving birth in colonial America was less glowing, miracle, and more voluntary haunting. And the social pressure to do it again and again and again was relentless. Fertility wasn't a blessing, it was a civic duty. A woman's worth was often measured in how many babies she delivered, and how few she buried. And if she failed at either, her reputation, and maybe her soul, was at stake. Imagine going into labor and handing your husband your will, not your hospital bag. If colonial America had a list of women most likely to upset the status quo, Anne Hutchinson would be laminated at the top, circled in red ink, and possibly burned just to be safe. Midwife, theologian, walking headache for Puritan leadership. She wasn't just a woman with opinions. She was a woman who said them out loud. And for a society built on male authority and religious anxiety, that was a spiritual emergency. Anne wasn't supposed to be anything special. Born in England in 1591, she married well, moved to the Massachusetts Bay Colony with her husband and children, and began attending church like every respectable woman was expected to. But Anne had a mind like a blade, sharp, polished, and wholly uninterested in staying in its sheath. She started hosting meetings in her home, originally to discuss sermons, innocent enough, until she started correcting them. You see, Anne didn't just parrot the minister's words. She challenged them, debated them, analyzed scripture like a 1600s Reddit mod dissecting plot holes in Leviticus. Worse, she started attracting followers. Lots of them, particularly women, including some who were supposed to be quiet, obedient, and vaguely terrified of their own knees. And here's where the midwifery comes in. Anne wasn't just a theological firestarter. She was also a practicing midwife, which meant she spent hours with other women in private rooms during their most vulnerable moments with no male supervision. And while delivering babies, she also delivered ideas that maybe grace didn't require church-sanctioned suffering, that maybe women could interpret scripture too, that maybe the patriarchy wasn't divinely mandated by God, but built out of insecure men with too many opinions about WOMBS. Naturally, this caused some issues. By 1636, Anne's home gatherings had turned into full-on theological salons, where people questioned predestination, grace, and whether the colony's ministers were even qualified to be leading anyone. Ministers, as in the guys who ran everything. And Anne, she wasn't pulling any punches. She called them out by name, publicly, on their doctrine, which, in colonial Massachusetts, was a bit like correcting the executioner's form mid-swing. Her enemies accused her of antinomianism, which is a fancy word for your preaching that people can follow God without listening to us. But what really bothered them, what truly got under their clerical robes, was that she was a woman doing all this. A woman with children. A woman who bled, delivered babies, and still dared to act like her soul had a voice. It didn't help that her reputation as a midwife gave her access to nearly every household. She wasn't just influencing random villagers. She was shaping the minds of future mothers, the wives of magistrates, the sisters of ministers. She became a theological vector, patient zero in a viral outbreak of independent thought. Then came the miscarriage. In 1638, Anne suffered a late-term miscarriage, but this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became political ammunition. According to a record written by her enemies, Anne miscarried 30 monstrous births. Yes, 30, in a single event. Which, if your thinking sounds medically impossible, you'd be right, unless she was giving birth to a cursed bag of marbles. But facts didn't matter. What mattered was the metaphor. They said her womb had rejected life itself, that God had judged her and turned her body into a factory of monstrosity. One colonial commentator even claimed the fetus had no head, but horns like a beast. Subtle, this grotesque fiction was paraded as divine proof that Anne's teachings were poisonous, that even her body bore witness to her sins. it wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a ritual degradation. A woman's loss turned into a public spectacle. And in that one horrific moment, we see exactly how the personal became political, and how quickly society weaponized a woman's body against her. Anne was tried for heresy, publicly interrogated for days by an all-male court, and eventually exiled from the colony. The transcript reads like an exhausted mother being gaslit by 12 men with matching wigs and fragile egos. They accused her of preaching, of disrupting the colony, and of receiving direct revelations from God, which, let's be honest, probably just meant she had convictions, and said them confidently. When they asked why she thought she could interpret scripture without a male intermediary, she replied calmly, "Because he hath given me the ability." Let that sink in. Not only did Anne Hutchinson refuse to deny her intelligence, she doubled down. She believed her spiritual insight was a gift, not a trespass. That women could commune with the divine, not just mop the floor where men preached. About him, she was excommunicated, banished, forced to leave the only home she'd known in the New World. With her children in tow, she moved to Rhode Island, and eventually to what is now New York, then still under Dutch control. A few years later, Anne and most of her children were massacred in an indigenous raid. Some accounts say she was scalped. Others say her body was never found. The men who exiled her declared it divine justice. Of course they did. And yet Anne's legacy lived on, not just in theological circles, but in the whisper networks of women who remembered, who told her story during long walks to the well, who repeated her name in birthing rooms, in secret prayer circles, and in quiet moments of defiance, not because she was perfect, but because she had dared to believe that a woman could think, speak, and challenge, and still be holy. So what? Does a miscarriage have to do with a courtroom? Everything. In a world where your womb was your worth, losing a pregnancy wasn't just a loss, it was evidence. And when you already scared the powerful men in charge, that evidence became a verdict. Imagine this. You're mid-labor, it's 3 a.m, and you're pretty sure your soul is halfway out of your body. A woman is standing over you, muttering a psalm in Latin while holding a leather pouch of herbs under your nose. In the corner, someone is chanting. The room smells like burning tallow and boiling nettles. And there, in the flickering candlelight, you realize this isn't just childbirth. This is a full-blown spiritual showdown, because in colonial America, giving birth wasn't just a medical event. It was a metaphysical experience, equal parts miracle and exorcism. And the midwife, she wasn't just your nurse. She was your priest, your shield, your spiritual bodyguard against evil. Her job wasn't just to deliver your baby, it was to keep you from dying and being possessed at the same time. Let's be clear, people genuinely believed that childbirth was an open portal, a moment when a woman's soul could slip out, and something else could slip in. That something else wasn't just metaphorical either. Demons, bad spirits, curses, the devil himself, they were considered real active forces, crouching at the edge of the birthing bed, like grotesque midwives from the underworld. So midwives developed rituals, protective ones, spiritual ones, because if you were responsible for bringing a soul into the world, you'd want a backup plan to dot. One of the most common rituals was the use of birthing amulets. These were small objects, beads, herbs, sometimes even tiny Bibles, sewn into sachets and placed under pillows or around the mother's neck. Juniper berries were popular, as were silver coins. and in more desperate cases, a crucifix dipped in oil and wrapped in a linen cloth. Think of it as a colonial lucky charm, but instead of warding off bad dates, it was there to keep Satan from hijacking your afterbirth. Then there were the Psalms. Oh, the Psalms. Psalm 23 was used often. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Not exactly subtle, but it wasn't just comfort, it was defense. Words were power, and midwives wielded scripture the way knights swung swords. Reciting the right verse at the right time could mean the difference between a safe delivery and a spiritual scandal. But if you really wanted to protect the baby, you baptized them fast. Infant baptism wasn't just a ritual. It was an insurance policy, because if the baby died before baptism, its soul might not go to heaven. That was the prevailing theological opinion. So, if the baby came out weak, not breathing, or clearly not going to make it, the midwife had to act. She'd sprinkle water, say the words, and hope God was listening. Sometimes it wasn't even a baptism. It was a whispered dedication, just enough to claim the child for the divine before death claimed it for everything else. And if the baby did survive, there were still more dangers ahead, because evil didn't clock out after delivery. It lingered in the umbilical cord, in the placenta, in the mother's weakened body. Midwives often handled these with reverence, and not just for hygiene. There were disposal rituals. Some buried the placenta under the hearth. Others burned it. In certain communities, it was wrapped in linen and buried near a tree to bless the child with strength. But if you were careless, say, you threw it out like food scraps, people might say you cursed the child's life before it began. And let's not forget the churched mother, still considered spiritually vulnerable weeks after giving birth. The devil was believed to linger around her, like mold in a damp cellar. Ministers warned women not to take communion until they'd been properly cleansed. Until then, they were seen as tainted, not just physically, but spiritually. Birth was messy, and mess, in Puritan theology, meant sin. Let that settle in your bones. A woman could perform the most life-affirming act possible, and still be seen as spiritually contaminated for doing it. There's even evidence of families requesting midwife affidavits, little written notes, confirming that the midwife saw the baby breathe, heard it cry, or was baptized before death. These were sometimes submitted to church authorities, especially if the family had enemies. Because even in death, a child's soul could become part of a theological turf war. All of this wasn't fringe. It was normal, routine, expected. Midwives carried prayer books alongside herbal tinctures. They knew how to turn a breech baby and how to recite a psalm over a dead one. They were scientists and shamans. They didn't just heal the body, they guarded the soul. But what happens when they failed? When a mother died during labor or a baby was stillborn, suspicion was almost automatic. Was the midwife really faithful? Did she skip the baptism? Did she say the psalm with enough conviction? Was her rosemary fresh? Because yes, apparently expired herbs were also a spiritual liability, and that failure didn't just stain the midwife's reputation. It could tarnish an entire household. People might avoid you. Your surviving children could be branded unlucky. Your marriage could suffer, because childbirth wasn't just a family matter. It was a community event. Everyone was invested. Everyone had an opinion. Even in the best cases, birth left scars. Physical, emotional, theological. And the rituals midwives performed weren't just superstition. They were survival tools. In a world that had no understanding of bacteria, no antibiotics, No C-section procedures, and certainly no therapy. A whispered prayer might be all you had. Birth and death were roommates, and the door between them, paper-thin. Imagine showing up to work, doing your absolute best to save a life for two, and then being told, weeks later, that you're expected in court, not to receive thanks, not even to offer a professional report, but to defend yourself for what went wrong, as if you conjured a stillbirth with your mind, as if your hands summoned death from the womb instead of life. That was reality for Colonial. Midwives, if something went sideways, and it often did, they didn't just carry the grief. They carried the blame in a time when pregnancy was a public affair and childbirth was a community event. Midwives weren't just medical professionals. They were witnesses, legal witnesses, spiritual witnesses, emotional witnesses, and that meant when things unraveled, everyone looked at them not just for answers, but for someone to punish. Let's start with a name. Goody Nurse. Yes, her actual name, or at least the Colonial shorthand for it. She was a respected midwife, a mother, a churchgoer, the textbook example of a good woman in Puritan society. But when babies started dying in her care, rumors began to spread like smoke through thatch. She was accused, not of malpractice, mind you, but of spiritual negligence. A chillingly vague crime. People claimed she didn't pray loud enough, that she didn't quote scripture during delivery, that she used non-approved herbs. When one mother died of what was likely an infection, Goody Nurse was interrogated, not about hygiene, not about blood loss, but about her tone. Her tone. Did she appear overly calm during the delivery? Did she weep the right amount? Did she make the sign of the cross with appropriate emotion? Her real crime wasn't what she did. It was how people felt about what she did. That was all it took. Another infamous case involved Goody Carrier, whose midwifery work and family disputes made her a perfect scapegoat. When her neighbor's child died after a long, complicated labor, the whispers started. She had looked too smug, someone said. She didn't share her prayer aloud. She smelled strange. A few bad harvests later, people were practically begging for someone to blame. She was hanged for witchcraft. The trials weren't always literal courtroom spectacles, though many were. Sometimes they were held in the court of public opinion, with no chance of defense. Midwives were ostracized, shunned, left off guest lists, called unlucky. All it took was one bad outcome, one complication, one scream that didn't end in a cry. In a world with no germ theory, no understanding of internal bleeding, no concept of postpartum complications, a mother's death was chalked up to one of two things: God's punishment or someone's mistake. And since blaming God was bad for morale, someone had to take the fall. And it's not just that they were blamed, they were used. Midwives were regularly called to testify at other people's trials. Their word could confirm paternity and moral character. In one case, a midwife was asked whether a mother looked ashamed during childbirth as evidence that the baby was illegitimate. Imagine being legally responsible for judging someone's facial expression while they're trying not to die. Worse still, they were required to perform post-birth examinations of unmarried mothers, a grotesque colonial version of forensic gynecology. They were supposed to determine whether a woman had recently given birth based solely on touch and experience. If they said yes, and no baby was present, well, that meant one thing: infanticide, yes. In colonial America, if you gave birth in secret and the child died, you could be charged with murder. It was assumed you must have killed the baby to hide your shame, and the midwife's testimony, often the only evidence required. But let's zoom in further, beyond the public accusations, beyond the gallows and gossip. What did this pressure do to the midwives themselves? Picture a woman who's seen a dozen births this season alone. 3 of them ended badly. She hasn't slept. She's buried 2 infants in the churchyard with her own hands. Her herbs are nearly gone. Her joints ache. And now she hears that. The mother-in-law of her last patient told the minister she felt something evil in the room. So what does she do? She prays louder. She uses more rosemary. She checks her tone, her posture, her face. Every birth becomes a performance, a sacred theater of survival, where one wrong note could end her career or her life. Midwives lived in this tension, needed but feared, respected but surveilled, and yet many continued. Not out of masochism, but out of duty, out of purpose, out of the quiet, stubborn belief that what they did mattered. Because for all the suspicion, for all the legal minefields, they were the only ones who truly understood birth, who stayed when things got hard, who didn't flinch at the blood, or the screams, or the silence that sometimes followed. Imagine doing your job, losing a baby, and then being tried as a murderer. That wasn't a hypothetical, that was Tuesday. Let's take a soothing stroll through a colonial herb garden. But don't relax too much. The odds are high that at least 3 of these plants could either save your life or end it, depending on which local gossip you asked and how much sleep the midwife had gotten that week. Herbal medicine was the backbone of colonial midwifery, mostly because, well, there wasn't anything else. Doctors, when they bothered to appear, usually arrived hours after a crisis, armed with leeches and an ego problem. So midwives did what women had always done, relied on knowledge passed down from mothers, grandmothers, and the collective memory of everyone who managed to survive long enough to talk about it. There's a reason midwives guarded their recipe. Books like modern influencers guard their DMIs. Every dried root, every scrap of parchment scrawled with mysterious measurements, was the product of decades, sometimes centuries, of experimentation, prayer, and good old-fashioned "I heard it from my neighbor's cousin." For pain, there was blue cohosh, chewed or brewed as a tea. A little too much, and you might see God before your baby arrived. For cramps, raspberry leaf, praised in every folk rhyme. For infection, golden seal, if you could find it, or garlic. Mugwort for delayed labor, or possibly to conjure a vision, depending on the phase of the moon and who you believed about witches. Of course, this was all before the phrase clinical trial meant anything besides, "Does anyone else die?" If I try this, the closest thing to double-blind testing was let's see if it works on the neighbor's cow before we try it on Susan. Scientific rigor meet abject necessity. Still, these remedies were lifelines. They gave midwives a toolkit, real or imagined, against the terrors of childbirth. A handful of dried feverfew might help with a stubborn headache. Comfrey, mashed into a paste, could soothe torn skin. Even willow bark made the rounds as a kind of prehistoric Tylenol, though no one knew why it worked, only that it sometimes did, and it tasted just as awful as you'd expect. But not all herbal experiments had happy endings. Enter the darker side: hemlock, foxglove, pennyroyal. In careful doses, these plants might gently nudge along a slow labor or ease the agony of a doomed birth. Too much, well, let's just say it wouldn't be the first time a sleeping draught lived up to its name a little too literally. Colonial. Graveyards are filled with the silent testimonies of dosing errors, passed off as God's will, or, more cynically, her time had come. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the raw courage it took to use these remedies. There were no warning labels, no measured droppers, no handy YouTube tutorials for herbal medicine, home edition, just a weathered wooden box, a handful of powders and leaves, and a prayer that you remembered which root was which. Of course, knowledge was currency, and sometimes a weapon. If a midwife healed too many people, she was eyed with suspicion. If her herbs failed, she was incompetent. Either way, she walked a razor-thin line between healer and hazard, always at the mercy of her next outcome. Let's zoom in for a moment. Imagine a birth gone wrong. The baby's coming breech. The mother is fading fast. The midwife, desperate, reaches for her most potent tincture, a last-ditch blend of wild black, cohosh, and honey. The labor slows, the baby turns, and there's a gasp of relief. But hours later, the mother spikes a fever. Was it the herbs? The exhaustion? Bad luck? No one will ever know. But you can bet the midwife will get the blame, along with a suspicious loaf of bread left on her doorstep as a warning. If you're thinking, isn't this risky? Well, so was everything in colonial medicine. Every birth was a gamble. Every remedy a roll of the dice. Even the act of gathering plants came with its own dangers. Stray too far from the path, and you might run into an angry landowner, a hungry wolf, or the town's own flavor of superstition. Why is she out picking herbs at dusk? Is she working for God or the other guy? Modern medicine has its wonders. Ultrasound, antibiotics, hospital staff who generally don't accuse you of witchcraft, but there's a bittersweet courage to the old ways. The midwives had nothing but their hands, their instincts, and the collective wisdom of everyone who survived before them. It wasn't science as we know it, but it was survival. Today, you can Google your symptoms and end up convinced you're dying of something rare. Back then, you foraged your anesthesia, prayed your neighbor liked you, and hoped your midwife's memory was better than her eyesight. Let that reality steep in for a moment. Herbs, hope, and hemlock, all tangled together. The original pharmacy, one dose away from healing. Or the grave, now we enter the nursery. But before you get visions of pastel paint, soft mobiles, and Instagrammable swaddling techniques, let's adjust expectations. Colonial nurseries were dim, drafty, and filled with as much dread as anticipation. In fact, if you were born in colonial America and survived long enough to learn to walk, you were already an anomaly and underage miracle in a world built on loss. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers are brutal. Infant mortality in colonial America hovered somewhere between horrific and don't ask. In some towns, 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday. Many families lost half their children before adulthood. It was so common that parents would reuse the names of dead children for the next in line. Little Thomas replaced by Thomas again, a living memorial to the sibling that didn't make it. Imagine the family photo albums. Every third page, a ghost. But how did colonial families deal with this omnipresent grief? With ritual, of course, with religion, with superstition, and with some traditions that now seem chilling to our modern, sentimental eyes. Enter the world of the posthumous portrait, the practice of dressing a deceased infant in their finest, sometimes only clothes, propping them in a chair and painting, or, later, photographing them surrounded by siblings, parents, and the family dog, all staring solemnly at the artist. The effect is both loving and, let's be honest, deeply unsettling. It was a way to remember the lost, to say, yes, they were here, even if only for a whisper. And if painting wasn't in the budget, families still marked the loss. Handmade. Tokens, lockets of baby hair, tiny knitted socks left at gravesides. The grief was never private. It was woven into the daily rituals, prayers at supper, black ribbons tied to doors, even lullabies that doubled as morning songs. Imagine singing your baby to sleep with verses about angels and the gentle arms of Jesus, just in case. Tonight was the night they didn't wake up. You might call that morbid. They called it preparation. But here's a haunting little twist. Sometimes, after a death, the mother herself was blamed. Not directly, not always, but in the way people looked at her across the churchyard. Was she too young? Too old? Did she nurse properly? Did she use the wrong herbs? There was no good way to grieve. A mother who wept was dramatic. A mother who didn't was cold. And the midwife, always hovering at the edge of the scene, carried her own private ledger of blame. Let's not forget the siblings either. Colonial children were raised alongside death, playing games among the gravestones, stepping over tiny coffins during burials, whispering stories about the baby who never came home. Ghost stories. They had plenty, but they didn't need to invent monsters. They'd seen enough real ones. The line between memory and myth was thin, and sometimes it was comforting to believe that the lost were still nearby, if only as shadows. At the foot of the bed, if all this sounds relentlessly bleak, pause and breathe for a moment. There was resilience here too. Life went on. Families found laughter, even in the midst of mourning. Children sang, mothers rocked, and fathers built cradles for the next attempt at hope. Communities rallied, bringing food, helping with chores. Sometimes just sitting in silence together, absorbing the grief like rain. Into thirsty soil. The colonial nursery was haunted, yes, but it was also a place of fierce, stubborn love. Of course, the fear lingered. Every cough, every fever, every rash brought dread. Superstitions multiplied. Hang garlic above the cradle. Tie red ribbons to the baby's wrist. Never let strangers see the child's face before baptism. Some mothers even refused to name the baby until it had survived a month or more. A superstitious hedge against loving too deeply, too soon. It was a game of emotional self-defense, where hope was rationed out one day at a time. And always, the midwife was there. She mourned the losses she couldn't prevent, quietly marking another notch on her soul. She comforted mothers, buried tiny bodies, whispered prayers over cradles and graves. Sometimes she was blamed. More often, she was simply tired. Imagine the psychic toll, watching life flicker out, over and over, while knowing that tomorrow you'd be summoned to help try again. The ghosts in the nursery didn't just haunt the families, they haunted the women who delivered them. But somehow, through it all, joy still managed to sneak in. A first laugh, a baby's wobbly steps, a child's shriek of delight at a moth's shadow on the wall. Each tiny victory was celebrated, even if it was tinged with anxiety. They held joy with one hand and grief with the other, all before breakfast. Let that sink in. An entire generation grew up expecting loss, yet they loved anyway. They risked hope. They sang lullabies to ghosts and babies alike, never knowing which would linger by morning. Just when colonial midwifery seemed like a permanent women's domain, part mystical sisterhood, part trauma support group, part don't tell the men, along came the 18th century, and, with it, the ultimate plot twist. men deciding they deserved a seat at the birthing stool. It was the dawn of the man midwife, a phrase so contradictory it almost feels like satire. Yet here we are, so what inspired this sudden male invasion? One word: tools. Specifically, forceps. That's right, metal tongs, resembling a medieval salad server, suddenly became the hottest ticket in town. The Chamberlain family, secretive French Huguenot émigrants, first brought the forceps to England and then to the American colonies, parading them as the solution to difficult births. For centuries, women had managed with hands, herbs, and whispered prayers. Now, men arrived waving surgical steel and confidence, ready to save both mother and child. If we're being honest, their own reputations. Let's paint the scene. It's 1742. The air is thick with tension and the lingering scent of disappointment. A labor has gone on for 2 days. The village midwife is exhausted, her arsenal of herbal teas and prayers long depleted. Enter Dr. William Shippen, Philadelphia's first American-born man midwife, sashaying in with his powdered wig and silver case. He's not interested in the circle of women. He's here for the main event, forceps glinting, ready to bring science, order, and probably a lecture about anatomy. To the women in the room, this was at once a marvel and a threat. Men claimed their tools made them more rational and precise, as if centuries of experience had been the product of mere guesswork. They wore coats instead of aprons. They charged more, used words like pudenda with a straight face, and were quick to assure everyone that their approach was modern, by which they meant mostly male. Of course, there was some truth to the value of forceps in complicated births. The ability to extract a stuck baby occasionally meant the difference between life and death, at least when handled by someone who actually knew how to use them. But forceps were a double-edged sword. Misuse could lead to crushing injuries, broken skulls, or trauma so severe that a mother might never recover. And let's not forget, sanitation standards had not suddenly improved just because a man was holding the tool. Still, the novelty and the authority of being male carried the day. Over time, more families, especially the wealthier, sought out man midwives for difficult cases. Women midwives began to be pushed to the margins, their knowledge discounted, their presence tolerated only until the gentlemen arrived. In towns across the colonies, a new hierarchy was born. Men with tools, women with experience, and a silent tension as old as Adam and Eve. Let's pause for a reflective breath here. For generations, birthing rooms had been women-only spaces. The sudden intrusion of men with medical ambitions wasn't just an awkward logistical change, it was a cultural earthquake. Women who had previously found comfort, camaraderie, and even privacy in these moments now found themselves exposed, examined, and, sometimes, humiliated. There are diary accounts of mothers weeping as unfamiliar men arrived, of midwives being told to stand aside, of birth becoming something that happened to women instead of with them. And there was drama. Some midwives resisted, refusing to yield to male doctors. Others adapted, learning new techniques, even collaborating with doctors, though usually through clenched teeth and gritted smiles. The communities watched as the old ways and the new clashed, debated, and sometimes outright brawled. There are stories, half history, half legend, of midwives hiding forceps to buy themselves more time, of doctors publicly shaming midwives in church, of mothers demanding their old midwife and being overruled by husbands eager for the latest modern miracle. The arrival of the male midwife also marked the rise of obstetrics as a profession, a science, not a calling. Universities in Europe and America started teaching men the art of childbirth, handing out certificates, and, eventually, medical degrees. Midwifery, once learned through experience, lineage, and whispered secrets, was now codified, measured, and placed in the hands of the people least likely to have ever experienced labor pains themselves. Yet, for all the bluster, not every family bought into the new order. In rural areas, and among the poor, women midwives remained the first and last defense against the unpredictable chaos of birth. Their numbers dwindled, but their influence lingered, especially where money or social standing couldn't summon a doctor by horseback, and so the old and new coexisted, sometimes in grudging partnership, often in rivalry. The birthing room became a battleground, a symbolic space where gender, power, and pain all collided again and again. So what happened when a man decided he was better at birth than centuries of midwives? Sometimes lives were saved. Sometimes lives were ruined. And always, history found a way to make it a little more complicated. Still with me? If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're either blessed with a titanium attention span, hopelessly fascinated by historical chaos, or drifting off while picturing colonial men fumbling around with forceps. Either way, give yourself some credit. This isn't your typical bedtime story, unless your idea of comfort is the whispered threat of spiritual contamination and the looming shadow of a powdered wig doctor. If you haven't yet, now's a good time to slip quietly onto the subscribe roster, if only to ensure you never miss another tale that's both more horrifying and more soothing than a lavender sleep mask. Settle in. The story's only getting stranger from here. Imagine entering the world in colonial America and discovering your entire existence depends on whether someone wrote your name in a damp, leather-bound ledger with ink made from oak goals and wishful thinking. Birth wasn't just the start of your life. It was the opening argument in a never-ending court case about who you were, where you belonged, and crucially, who owned the land after you died. The stakes, everything from property to legitimacy to family honor. Let's talk paperwork, or, more accurately, the fever dream that passed for paperwork in the colonies. Most births were recorded at home, scribbled onto family Bibles, or written by a trembling, sleep-deprived minister. If you were lucky, the midwife, yes, the same one dodging witchcraft accusations, was there to witness and sign. If not, well, good luck proving you existed in a decade. The lack of a formal birth certificate wasn't just a bureaucratic inconvenience, it was a social landmine. Inheritance laws were brutal and unforgiving. The difference between being the eldest son and some kid who showed up last harvest could mean the difference between inheriting a farm or being turned out as a servant. Entire lawsuits hinged on the testimony of midwives, who were asked to swear, sometimes years after the fact, that yes, they did indeed see little Thomas born, probably around midnight, maybe during a thunderstorm. But here's the problem. Memory is fallible, especially when it's battered by sleep deprivation, trauma, and a town's worth of overlapping tragedies. Midwives might attend dozens of births in a season. If you were hoping for digital accuracy, you'd have better luck finding Wi-Fi in a Puritan barn. Yet, their word carried weight, because, frankly, there was nothing else to rely on. The law was a blunt instrument, wielded mostly by men who had never delivered a child, and often by magistrates who could barely read their own writing. There were horror stories of families faking birth records, sneaking into rival homes too. Alter Bibles, or bribing midwives to forget or remember key details. Sometimes, the simple act of being born became an act of social warfare, the stakes ratcheted higher by the desperate need to secure lineage, property, or a scrap of respectability. And when things got ugly, they got really ugly. Take the case of Sarah, born to an unmarried mother. No father's name, no midwife willing to vouch for the birth. She became, by default, a bastard, a legal status that followed her for life. She couldn't inherit property, couldn't marry well, and, should her mother die, could be handed over to a parish or sent away as an indentured servant, all because of a missing signature. For wealthier families, the opposite was true: birth records became weapons, proof to secure land, settle feuds, or even claim titles in the old country. Imagine being 11 and already at the center of a land dispute, with grown men poring over your baptismal certificate by candlelight, searching for a misspelled name that could make or break your future and death. Well, if birth records were a mess, death records were a carnival of confusion. When a baby died before being formally named or baptized, the ambiguity could ripple for generations. Was the child counted as part of the lineage? Did the family owe a burial fee? Should the mother be churched or shunned? These were not small questions. The answers shaped inheritance, social standing, and sometimes even who got to sit in which pew at church. Let's not forget the role of midwives as legal witnesses. They weren't just delivering babies. They were human notaries, expected to remember exact times, dates, and sometimes the emotional tenor of a birth. Did the mother seem anxious? Did she curse her husband's name? Their recollections could determine whether a widow inherited her home, or whether a distant cousin swooped in with a conveniently vague claim. Imagine the pressure. Every birth attended was a future lawsuit waiting to happen. And then there were the horror stories: accidental lost children, swapped infants, disputed twins. There's one recorded case of a pair of twins, both girls, born to a family in New Haven. One midwife claimed the older girl came first. Another swore it was the younger. When the inheritance came due, each girl's claim was argued before a court, based entirely on which exhausted midwife the judge believed. This wasn't just paperwork, it was power. It was the difference between security and poverty, belonging and exile. Some children were born with hope. Others were born into lawsuits. It's easy to romanticize the past, to picture colonial families gathered around the hearth, recording each birth in a lovingly illuminated script. The truth is closer to chaos. Ink-stained fingers, whispered arguments, and a desperate scramble to secure a child's future before the memory faded, or before someone else wrote a better story. So next time you see a dusty old family Bible, imagine the lives tangled between its pages, not just names and dates, but the raw, trembling urgency to prove I was here. I mattered, and in this world of blood and shadows, someone, at least, remembered my first breath. Let's dim the lantern and step into the realm where science, faith, and straighter paranoia all sleep in the same cramped bed. Colonial America was less a land of reason and more a choose-your-own-adventure for superstitionists, especially when it came to birth. If you thought modern parenting forums were stressful, imagine a world where the wrong phase of the moon could doom your baby and your midwife might actually have a talisman hidden in her apron. In the absence of reliable medicine, and with the church forever warning about the devil's sticky fingers, people filled the gap with folklore. Not just quaint little stories, but operational manuals for daily life. The boundaries between fact and fable blurred to the point of non-existence. Take the role of salt. It wasn't just for flavor. Salt was sprinkled in the birthing room too. Ward off evil spirits. A small bowl might be placed under the bed, or lines of salt traced around the threshold. Why? Because everyone knew evil couldn't cross salt. Ask anyone except a scientist, because they were in short supply and generally unwelcome. Timing mattered too. It was considered unlucky to give birth during a thunderstorm, a full moon, or while a dog howled at the door. Some midwives refused to deliver babies if the winds from the east were too strong, a red flag for bad omens, though a green light for extended labor stories at the tavern later. Then there was the matter of second sight, the idea that certain midwives could see things others couldn't. Some claimed to dream of deaths before they happened. Others swore they could predict the child's future by the shape of its feet or the curl of its hair. If a midwife was especially accurate, she was gifted, but a little too accurate, and suddenly she was dangerous. Suspicion hung in the air like incense, thickening with every odd event. Animals got involved, too. If a black cat crossed the threshold during labor, mothers clutched their bellies and prayed harder. A rooster crowing at midnight meant trouble. And don't even think about letting a toad near the birthing room. The colonial logic was airtight. Nature and the supernatural danced together, tripping over each other with every birth. Let's pause and consider the diary of Mary Rowlandson, a minister's wife who survived Indian captivity and lived to write about it. She described a birth in her village where, after the baby came early and sickly, neighbors claimed to see a banshee hovering by the window, a pale figure in white, wringing her hands. Was it fever-fueled delirium, or a collective need for an explanation when medicine had none? Mothers and midwives alike practiced small rituals just in case, placing iron under the pillow to keep away changelings fairy imposters swapped for real babies, painting a red X on the door to confuse malicious spirits, burning certain herbs to clear the air. Although one can assume the main effect was to cover up the smell of fear and sweat. But superstition wasn't just about the negative. Sometimes it was a desperate attempt at control, a way to impose a pattern on chaos. Imagine watching child after child die, generation after generation. Wouldn't you grab onto any sliver of hope, even if it meant singing to the full moon or counting crows in the yard? These rituals weren't just nonsense, they were survival, faith, and therapy rolled into one. Of course, for every act of protection, there were equal and opposite accusations. If a baby thrived despite a bad sign, people called it a miracle. If the baby faltered, someone must have broken a rule. The web of blame was sticky and vast. A midwife accused of using second sight to predict a stillbirth might one day be begged for her blessing and the next be shunned as a witch, and no one could ever really tell the difference. The irony is almost soothing. The more uncertainty people faced, the more elaborate their superstitions grew. They whispered secrets, passed charms, and spun stories to explain what the world refused to make clear. It's easy to laugh at now until you remember your own rituals, the lucky socks, the knock on wood, the desperate pleas, just this once bargains you make with the universe. Were they paranoid, or just paying attention? Let that settle. In like the slow, smoky haze after an anxious midnight, colonial people weren't fools. They were terrified, imaginative, and human, trying to coax safety out of a world that rarely gave it freely. So, If you ever find yourself sprinkling salt across a doorway or clutching a charm before a big moment, just remember, you're in good company. The line between superstition and sanity is finer than any of us like to admit. Pull back the curtain on colonial life, and beneath the sermons, superstitions, and suffocating expectations, you'll find a secret network humming quietly beneath the surface. Forget the town crier, the blustering magistrates, or even the ever-suspicious midwives. The real engine of survival was the web of women who saw, heard, and held each other through it all. They were, in every sense, the secret sisters. It started young. Girls learned quickly that their world belonged to men publicly, at least. But behind closed doors, power shifted. It was in the kitchen, in the laundry, by the well, and especially in the birthing room. Here, stories flowed like cider. Warnings, remedies, gossip, confessions. You might think of this as colonial therapy, except the only couch was a pile of mending, and the bill was paid in secrets kept. Midwives, of course, stood at the center of these circles, but they weren't alone. Mothers, aunts, neighbors, even rival families banded together when it mattered. If a labor dragged on for days, women would take turns at the bedside, wiping sweat, murmuring encouragement, and if things got truly grim, sitting quietly in solidarity. No judgments, no sermons, just presence. Sometimes that was all anyone could offer. There was an unspoken code. What happened in the birthing room, or the kitchen, or at the river, stayed there. Advice was given in riddles, warnings couched in jokes. Don't use too much mugwort, unless you're fond of sleep. Watch out for the minister's wife. She hears things through walls. Laughter could be a shield, a bomb, and, in some cases, the only medicine available. It wasn't all bleak. These secret sisters celebrated each other, too. When a new baby survived, when a woman pulled through a dangerous labor, when a girl finally became a woman, they gathered, whispered prayers, and, occasionally, snuck a celebratory sip of something stronger than cider. Joy was private, fierce, and often tinged with relief. But their power wasn't just in crisis. In a society obsessed with reputation, women managed the complex economy of favors and forgiveness. Need a loaf of bread after a bad harvest? Ask the neighbor whose baby you helped rock last winter. Need a safe place to cry? Seek out the widow who knows grief like a second language. The debts were rarely spoken of, but always remembered. These networks crossed class and sometimes even racial lines. Enslaved women, and indigenous women, too, had their own sisterhood spaces of solidarity and resistance, woven from the scraps of freedom denied to them by the world outside. Stories were shared, advice traded, and acts of quiet rebellion plotted in whispers. Sometimes, these networks overlapped in moments of crisis or celebration. Sometimes, they ran in parallel, unseen but essential. Of course, none of this was risk-free. If a secret sisterhood was suspected of undermining a husband, hiding an illicit pregnancy, or heaven forbid passing along an unapproved remedy, the whole network could come under scrutiny. And yet, these bonds persisted, precisely because the alternative was unthinkable. Isolation, silence, and the slow erosion of hope. Let's pause for a moment and breathe in the radical act of women supporting. Women in a world that offered them so little. The colonial narrative was written by men, but its footnotes, its real substance, were inked by these secret acts of care and courage. Imagine, for a second, Goody Brown, a midwife on the edge of exhaustion after 3 sleepless nights. She finds a loaf of bread and a note at her door. Rest today. We'll cover your rounds. No signature, no fuss. Just a reminder that even the strongest hands need holding sometimes. Or picture a young mother haunted by a loss she can't name, taken by the hand by an older woman who's been there and survived. No words, just tea and time and quiet understanding. In a world trying to silence them, they whispered each other into power. They made a soft, stubborn revolution out of every act of empathy. No law could codify it. No minister could ban it. The legacy of these secret sisters is written in the resilience that allowed families and entire communities to survive. Today, we think of support networks as self-help groups, apps, or in colonial America, it was the neighbor who watched your children so you could grieve. The friend who stitched an extra seam in your skirt, knowing you'd need it. The circle of hands that steadied you during labor and kept your secrets safe. Long after the danger had passed, it wasn't grand or flashy or celebrated in sermons. But it was essential, as much a part of survival as salt, prayer, or superstition. If you look closely, you'll see their fingerprints on every page of colonial history, not in the bold, official lines, but in the delicate margins. In a world trying to silence them, they whispered each other into power. Fast forward, the century turns, the candles are swapped for gaslight, and suddenly, everything about childbirth in America is up for negotiation. If the colonial era was all barn births and secret sisterhoods, the 19th and early 20th centuries were about something entirely new: systematic disruption, modernization, institutionalization. In other words, taking something ancient, deeply communal, and supremely female, and turning it into paperwork, policy, and the occasional patent. It starts quietly, almost sneakily, in the growing cities. As hospitals sprang up and the Industrial Revolution churns in the background, the old Wazubs whispered prayers, the reassuring chaos of the birthing stool are labeled backward. Enter the era of the medical profession, which is to say, the era of the male medical profession. Birth is packaged as a problem to be solved, not a rite of passage to be witnessed. Obstetricians in crisp white coats begin to crowd out the goody browns and the secret sisters, armed with forceps, chloroform, and a barely concealed sense of entitlement. Let's set the scene. It's the 1890s. A woman in labor is whisked from her home to a hospital. If her family can afford it, stripped of her familiar support system and handed over to strangers. Her husband paces the corridor, chain-smoking. The nurse, if she's lucky enough to have one, follows the doctor's orders without question. Gone are the crowded, sweaty rooms filled with neighbors and friends. In their place, tiled walls, cold instruments, silence. The old birthing stool is replaced by a high, metal-framed bed. Birth becomes a solo sport, played out under the watchful eyes of people with degrees. Progress. In some ways, yes. Maternal and infant mortality rates begin to fall slowly at first, then more dramatically, thanks to antiseptics, anesthesia, and the eventually radical idea that washing your hands might actually help. Doctors, not midwives, record the birth. Hospital forms, not Bibles, mark the start of a life. But not everything improves. There's a cost to this shiny new system. The wisdom of midwives, honed over centuries, is dismissed as superstition, even though half the new procedures are borrowed straight from them. Women who once delivered their babies, surrounded by a chorus of supporters, now labor alone, told to be quiet, to lie still. To trust the experts, never mind that the experts haven't actually given birth themselves. The new order brings its own dangers, hospital-acquired infections, unnecessary interventions, twilight sleep, a sedative-laced haze that leaves mothers disoriented and babies at risk, but conveniently silent for the staff. Women's pain is minimized, their choices ignored, and their bodies transformed into objects of study. There's a famous photo of a medical school lecture hall. Rows of young men in dark suits, all fixated on a lone, unconscious woman being used to demonstrate a difficult delivery. The audience, eager, the subject, silent. Meanwhile, the old traditions persist, especially among the poor, the rural, and the marginalized. In the Appalachian Hills, the bayous of Louisiana, among black and indigenous communities, midwives continue to serve families who are shut out, or shut in by the medical establishment. These granny midwives, as they're sometimes called, keep the flame of communal birth alive, teaching their daughters what the textbooks won't print. But the medicalization of birth keeps advancing. By the mid-20th century, hospitals dominate the scene. Birth is now a scheduled event, a billable procedure, a reason to cut the umbilical cord between women and their hard-won autonomy. Obstetrics becomes a business, complete with malpractice, insurance, and hospital gowns. Women's healthcare enters the vocabulary, but the voices of actual women often struggle to be heard above the hum of machinery and the shuffling of paperwork. Let's pause. Think about what's been gained on, what's been lost. Lower death rates? Yes. Life-saving interventions? Certainly. But also the loss of connection, tradition, and control. The barn may have been unsanitary, but it belonged to the family. The boardroom may be gleaming, but who's really in charge? Modern birthing suites try to recapture the comfort of home with dim lighting and soothing playlists. Doulas and nurse midwives are back in fashion, promising a more holistic experience. But the shadow of those old battles lingers. Whose knowledge counts? Who gets to decide what birth looks like, feels like, means? Here's the truth. Today, we call it women's healthcare. Back then, it was survival theater. The tools have changed. The stakes, not so much. For every advance, there's a reminder that the history of childbirth is, at its core, the history of power, who holds it, who wields it, and who, in the final push, gets to claim the story as their own. Let that thought carry you gently into the night. Progress is real, but memory is stubborn, and somewhere, under the clinical light and careful protocols, the voices of the secret sisters still echo soft, persistent, unwilling to be forgotten. Time to switch on the fluorescent lights of the 21st century and squint at just how much hasn't changed. For every modern labor and delivery unit, with its wall-mounted monitors and pain management menus, a little ghost of colonial America lingers in the corner. You might not see her, but she's there. Part midwife, part mother, part cautionary tale about what happens when power, gender, and medicine get tangled up in each other's business. Let's start with trust, or rather, the chronic shortage of it. Colonial women feared their midwives might be witches. Modern women worry their doctors won't listen. In both worlds, birth is something done to women, more than something experienced with them. Sure, the risks have shifted from demons in the shadows to bureaucratic indifference, but the uneasy suspicion remains. A 2020 study found that nearly 1 in 3 American mothers across races and incomes reported feeling dismissed or ignored by medical staff during labor. That's not an old wives' tale. It's today's reality. And then there's race. In colonial times, the boundaries were brutally clear. Black and indigenous women often had their own birthing traditions, forcibly erased or forcibly appropriated. Flash forward, and the disparities are just as grim. Black women in the US are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Stats so medieval you almost expect to see a witch hunt in the footnotes. Stories abound of pain ignored, symptoms minimized, and outcomes blamed on personal responsibility instead of systemic failure. Modern medicine likes to position itself as a clean break from the past. Out with the old superstitions, in with the data-driven protocols. But scratch the surface, and you'll find old ghosts, hierarchies, suspicion, the old habit of gatekeeping knowledge. Doctors, still mostly male in senior ranks, hold the keys. 2 hospital corridors lined with blinking machines, while women, now patients instead of parishioners, are told when, how, and even if they can give birth their way. The birthing stool becomes the hospital bed, and the liturgy is replaced by a consent form. Same anxiety, new vocabulary. Let's not get too gloomy though. There are real wins: safe C-sections, fetal heart monitors, epidurals, thank every god and goddess for epidurals. Doulas and nurse midwives are back in fashion, advocating for patient voices and bodily autonomy. Some hospitals even offer gentle C-sections and family-centered care, complete with skin-to-skin contact and dimmed lights. Progress is undeniable, especially for those who can pay for it. But listen closely and you'll still hear colonial echoes, the need to advocate for yourself. The stories of trauma and triumph passed quietly from one mother to another, in waiting rooms and online forums. The ever-present risk that a labor gone wrong might be blamed on a woman's character, choices, or the unlucky stars under which she was born. Let's zoom in on a story. Meet Lorena, modern mother in a top-tier hospital, armed with an app, a birth plan, and the hope that technology will make everything predictable. Her labor stalls. Nurses change shifts. A doctor she's never met recommends a C-section. She tries to ask questions, but feels hurried, uncertain. She's healthy, privileged, informed, yet she leaves the hospital days later feeling unheard, disoriented, alone. It's not witchcraft, but it is a kind of disenchantment. For marginalized women, the stakes are even higher. Consider Asha, whose concerns about postpartum pain are dismissed as normal recovery. Weeks later, an infection nearly kills her. Her story isn't rare. It's typical. The system is built to prioritize efficiency, not empathy. It's more comfortable with data than discomfort. And so, the cycle continues, old anxieties in new gowns. Yet hope lingers in the margins, just like it did centuries ago. Grassroots. Organizations led by black midwives and doulas are reclaiming lost wisdom, training new generations to bridge the gap between patient and practitioner. Social media becomes the new kitchen, the new riverbank, the place where birth stories, both horror and healing, are shared, challenged and honored. Let's pause and breathe. How much has really changed? The tools are new, but the struggle is old. Women still fight to be heard, to be safe, to be cared for on their own terms. In the quiet spaces between medical milestones, the same questions echo. Who do you trust? Whose knowledge counts? What stories get written? And whose voices get left out? There's comfort in remembering that every hospital corridor is haunted in the best way by the women who came before, who bled and wept and laughed and raged, sometimes all at once. They're the secret sisters, the unsung midwives, the mothers whose stories still matter, whether anyone writes them down or not. So next time you pass a sleeping baby or a nurse on her 5th cup of coffee, tip your hat to the ghosts of the past. Their lessons are still written in every chart, every whispered prayer, every hard-won moment of joy. Picture her in the early dawn, shawl wrapped tight, boots muddied by 1,000 footsteps across 3 colonies. Goody Blackwell, the last midwife of her kind. Her name appears in church records, faded letters, and that infamous ledger stuffed between 2 recipes for mugwort tea and a note about the Miller baby's extra finger. She is both a composite and a singularity, a stand-in for the dozens, maybe hundreds, of women who witnessed more births and deaths than some ministers gave sermons. Goody Blackwell's story begins like so many others. Daughter of a midwife, granddaughter of an herb woman. She learns early that secrets are currency and courage is something you practice, not possess. She trains in kitchens and sick rooms, watching her mother mix herbs with one hand and comfort grieving fathers with the other. Her first birth comes at age 14, a neighbor's wife in crisis, no men in sight, blood, prayers, the metallic scent of hope and fear colliding. She acts, guided by hands steadier than her heart, and the baby survives. So does she. By the time she is 25, Goody Blackwell is the one you call when hope is thin. She's seen by candlelight at doors, summoned in storms, whispered about in market squares. Some say she has the sight, she can predict outcomes before the labor begins. Others just say she's lucky. She lets them believe both. Superstition is as useful as skill in a world where bad luck looks for a scapegoat. Her methods are neither mystical nor modern. She washes her hands in boiled water, more from instinct than science. She prays sometimes aloud, sometimes only in her head. She keeps rosemary and juniper on hand, but also scissors and strong linen. Her hands are rough, her eyes watchful. She doesn't promise miracles, only that she will stay until the end. But even the best midwife can't outwit fate. Goody Blackwell has her share of failures, and the weight of them sags her shoulders. She buries children she delivered. She writes names, first, middle, sometimes just baby, in her own journal, a private roll call of the lost. She listens to mothers sob, holds fathers who won't weep in public, offers the same comfort to both. You did what you could, we all did. Then come the accusations. One winter, after a cluster of stillbirths, she is called before the town elders. They question her methods, her faith, her relationships. Did she attend church enough? Did she burn the right herbs? Did she, perhaps, know too much for her own good? The whispers are as cold as the frost outside, and for a moment, Goody Blackwell thinks she might not return home. But the mothers speak. One by one, the women of the town defend her. She saved my child. She stayed with me through the night. She is the reason I'm here. Their voices, quiet but unyielding, drown out the suspicion. Goody is allowed to continue, though the shadow of doubt never quite leaves her side. As the years pass, times change. A new doctor arrives from Boston Young, educated, full of ideas about forceps and progress. Some families turn to him, eager for a taste of the future. Others cling to Goody Blackwell, trusting the hands that have already carried them through. The Valley of Shadows. She adapts when she can. She learns a few new techniques, watches the doctor work, even helps him on occasion, though she never quite warms to his chilly confidence. When a birth goes badly and the doctor blames the Old ways, Goody says nothing. She's lived long enough to know that every age invents new reasons to be afraid. Near the end of her life, Goody Blackwell attends her last birth. The mother is her granddaughter, thin, strong girl with her stubborn chin. The room is brighter than it used to be, windows uncovered, the world outside less frightening than before. The birth is difficult, as most are, but the baby arrives, loud and alive. Goody cuts the cord, wipes her brow, and feels the years slip from her shoulders. For just a moment. Later, alone, she writes in her journal, one more cry, one more chance. She wonders if her own hands will be remembered. A century from now, anyone will say her name with gratitude, or only as a whisper in the dark. She has regrets, of course, the babies she lost, the mothers she couldn't save, the times she doubted herself but carried on because there was no one else. But in the end, what endures are the lives she helped bring forth, the families she kept whole, the network of women who, through her, learned to trust each other. A little more, she brought life into the world, but carried so much death in silence. Let that linger as you close your eyes. The last midwife, the last of a line, the last to carry all those voices inside her voices that perhaps have never truly faded. The candle gutters low. The night hushes thick as wool as we slip away from barns, birthing stools, and the weary hands of Goody Blackwell. You might think the story is over. You'd be wrong. History doesn't sleep. It just changes rooms. There's a reason bedtime stories are often fairy tales. We like to believe the past is safely locked away, a monster tamed by the passage of time. But if you've listened this far, you know colonial America wasn't built on comforting fables. It was built on blood, sweat, and whispered prayers on women who braved the darkness. And on the sharp edge, where survival and suspicion meet, imagine lying in your narrow bed, the wind clawing at your shutters, a log popping in the hearth. Somewhere in the dark, a woman keens in labor, her cries muffled by hands and hope. Outside, the town sleeps, but within the low-lit house, the drama of birth equal parts, terror and wonder plays out as it has for generations. The midwife whispers encouragement, the women wait with held breath, and the boundary between this world and whatever comes next feels paper-thin. The truth is, the ghosts of these stories never really left. You can feel them, can't you? In every hospital corridor, in every anxious hush when a labor stalls, in every parent's secret prayer that this time all will be well. We inherit their fears and their courage, the rituals of hope and the reflexive search for meaning when something goes wrong. Let's not sanitize it. The history of birth in America is not gentle. It is not always safe, or fair, or logical. It's raw and unfinished. A narrative of survival written by those who were too busy laboring literally to ever pen their own versions. The hands that caught babies also buried them. The voices that comforted mothers also buried their own grief beneath stoic smiles. The community that celebrated new life sometimes turned on its healers in a heartbeat, searching for someone to blame when fate refused to be tamed. So sleep now, if you can, with one eye open, perhaps, not out of fear, but out of a kind of awe and acknowledgement that what we call women's work was never soft, never simple, never boring. It was, and remains, the most dangerous kind of magic, the summoning of life out of nothing but flesh and faith, sweat and sorrow. Let that settle in your chest. Birth was never a private event, never just a family affair. It was public, political, and profoundly spiritual. Even today, when you flick off the light and pull the covers up, you're surrounded by echoes of lullabies and laments, of old superstitions and new anxieties, of the whispered names of those who made it and those who didn't. Take a deep breath. Feel the hush that follows a hush, packed with the weight of stories untold and sacrifices unseen. The ghosts in the nursery still hum their lullabies. The secret sisters still keep their midnight watch. The last midwife's hands still hover, trembling but unbowed, ready to catch you if you fall. They called it women's work, but it was never soft, so close your eyes if you dare. Drift off into the dark, knowing you're held not just by history, but by the tenacity of those who endured, wept, and dreamed before you. Good night. Sleep tight. If you're still awake, you're a rare kind of soul, and you, friend, are exactly who this channel is for. Hit subscribe for more softly spoken nightmares and deeply researched rabbit holes. And next time someone says history is boring, remind them that birth used to end in both miracles and murder trials. Sleep well, or try.